It is March 19, 2008. My name is Don Linky. We're here on the campus of Rutgers University at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. This is another in the continuing series of interviews we've been conducting for the Rutgers program on the governor here at the Eagleton Institute. We're compiling the Brendan T. Byrne archive, and this morning we'll be talking with Sanford Jaffe, who is currently co-director of the Center for Negotiation and Conflict Resolution at Rutgers, and has had a long and varied career in academia, the nonprofit sector, with as a senior executive with the Foreign Foundation, and in a variety of roles as heads of commissions, task forces, Supreme Court committees, and the like. We'll be discussing Sandy's I think diverse relationship with Brendan Byrne over the years, and also his personal background and the history of his career in public policy, particularly as it relates to New Jersey. Okay. Sandy, before we talk about Brendan Byrne, let's talk about you.
Okay.
Family, background, education.
Okay. Well, let's start with my family. Both my parents were immigrants to this country. Came here, I guess, around 1908, 1910, in the last great immigration from Eastern Europe. And I was the first of my family's generation actually born in the United States. I went to grammar school and high school in Newark, New Jersey. Attended Peshawar Avenue Grammar School, which is in the lower South Ward, and then went to Weequahic High School and graduated from there. When I left high school, because of financial considerations, I could not go to school during the day, college during the day, and so I applied to and was accepted at Rutgers University College, which is the evening school at Rutgers University, and I went there for 2 years, which was an interesting experience and for me a very valuable experience, since I had been an exceptionally poor student in high school. Probably wouldn't have gotten into Rutgers during the day anyway. And then in college, in Rutgers at the evening, began to really get interested in schoolwork, etc. You were going to...
Well, let me push you back a little bit.
Sure.
Since the city of Newark is a significant, I think, location in your career, what are your early memories of Newark growing up?
Well, you know, I remember obviously a very crowded urban environment. It was an environment that was primarily, at least in the areas I lived, relatively lower middle class and poor people. Most people lived in tenement houses or lived in apartment houses at that point. The area I lived in was one of the few areas of Newark at that point that was fairly racially diverse. There were a number of blacks who lived in that area. There were a number of ethnics, primarily Italian and some Polish and so forth, and a fairly significant, although somewhat minority, Jewish community. So it was a very diverse, both ethnic and racial community, and as my recollections, a fairly poor community, primarily, in fact, all working class. And it was the kind of neighborhood in which you spent most of your time playing out on the street and doing things out on the street. It was, and walking to school, etc. So it was that kind of a place to be brought up. On the other hand, I think it had a lot of tremendous advantages. You really got to know people of different races and ethnicity. You got to understand what it was like to be brought up in that kind of environment. And I think that in those early days, you kind of forge various bonds into a community, and I think it helps in terms of developing you as a person. It taught me a lot of skills in terms of resilience. It taught me a lot of skills in terms of survivor. how to survive. I learned when I was, I learned to never walk into a room without, to a restaurant or a place without making sure I knew where the exit was. I learned when I came home late at night, walk in the middle of the street so that anybody hiding behind bushes, I had at least an opportunity, somewhat paranoid, but maybe somewhat realistic at the same time. So I think you learn a lot on how to really get by at that time.
Did you get any feel as a very young person of the politics of the time?
Yes, not a lot, but my dad, although being an immigrant to this country and having a great deal of difficulty, did not really know how to read or write English. He could read Jewish newspapers, as did my mom. But my dad was always interested in politics, and so I would, on election days, help him. He usually got employed as a poll watcher or that kind of thing, and that was my job too on election days. And I remember at the end of the evening going up and taking the election results when they would come and read the machines and bringing them down to various headquarters. And so I got very much interested in politics at that time. And Newark at that time was a city commission form of government. And what that meant was that there were 5 commissioners who really ran the city, and they were always broken down by racial and ethnic diversity. So I understood the imperatives of racial and ethnic politics, because Newark was an extraordinarily good place that was practiced.
Who was the first mayor you remember?
I think the first mayor I actually remember was Leo Carlin. A fellow by the name of Ellenstein had been mayor in the late 30s, but I don't remember. And I read a lot about it when I got to understand New Jersey politics, etc. But I think Leo P. Carlin, I remember, was the first mayor that I recall.
What did your father do for a living?
My dad.
Problem?
Yeah. My dad did, I guess, what a lot of immigrants did. He just did a variety of various jobs and ran a whole bunch of little businesses. At one point, he sold real estate, but then I understand with the Great Depression in 1932, the real estate business went south, and my dad had owned some property, and that was all gone. And so he went from there to running a dry cleaning business with one of my uncles. Did that for about a year or two. Then I think my uncle got into some problems on involving a liquor issue, and so my uncle left and that dry cleaning business went. And then my dad bought a very small little candy store on a street on Hawthorne Avenue in Newark, which is in the Clinton Hills section. And he ran the candy store from about 1933 to about 1939. And we had, I have a sister, and we had 3 rooms in the back of the candy store where we lived. And then my dad, in 1939, sold the candy store, and I even remember for the grand price of $800. And he then got a job in a defense plant. This was just about the time that the United States was beginning to gear up in terms of armaments, just really early time in the late 1930s, 39, 40. And so he worked as a sheet metal person in a factory in East Newark, and did that until the end of the war, when that opportunity was gone. And then he ran a small secondhand furniture store for a while, and then kind of retired.
Now, you've mentioned the diversity of your neighborhood. Did you feel sort of the difference between the wealthy and the poor people in Newark, or was it, since the neighborhood was generally of the same level, that wasn't obvious?
Well, you know, when I went to grammar school, it was pretty much the same level. because it was really primarily poor and lower, and lower middle class. Although a few kids who came from a part of the lower South Ward that was a little bit more wealthy, but not a great deal. I think that when I went to Week Lake High School, there was a tremendous difference. I lived, as I said, I was closer to a high school called Southside, and that school had much more, was populated much more by kids of lower middle income and poor. Week Lake High School had a lot of reasonably wealthy students because the Week Lake section, the upper part of the Week Lake section, was really very, very wealthy. And the high school had an extraordinarily high college rate. 95% of the kids who went there went to college, and it had an extraordinarily good faculty there. And so I noticed a very significant differences in the experiences I had and the kind of world where a lot of the other students came from, and I subsequently became friends with. But I do remember that for the first year or two, it was a process of acclimation and getting used to a different a group of people who came from a different lifestyle than I did.
Now, you said that you had financial issues in terms of going on from high school to college. Was there a severe choice as to whether to go out and work and help the family?
But there was really no choice. I had no choice but to go out and help. My dad, at that point, the furniture store was not an extraordinarily business-making enterprise. It was up in East Orange. And I used to go there after school when I was in high school and help out, my dad, help out, cover dining room chairs or stuff like that. Not being particularly handy, I was not much of a help. But in any case, I'd go. But he really did not really make very much money at that point. It was really not. And so when I got out of school, my sister had left to go to Israel. She left after her grad. She's 2 years older than me. She went to Israel to live and work on a kibbutz. And there was really no choice. There was no money for me to go to school. And I really had to help support my mom, dad, and me. So I really did need to get a job. And luckily, when I was in high school, I got to be friends with a young woman who was very, very pleasant, who I knew very well. And her uncle ran a insurance company, insurance brokerage firm in Newark. And so she helped me get a job there. My first beginnings in the insurance world. Anyway, that job was in downtown Newark and paid reasonably well. I forgot what it was, but paid reasonably well. And I had in high school gotten to be very friendly with a teacher, a social studies teacher, who I think recognized in me a certain ability that I didn't even recognize. And I always tell a story that people laugh at, but I used to make book reports by reading classic comics. I had never really read a book until I got into college. And she one day wrote back on a report I turned in that great report, but you cannot live life going through classic comics. And so she and I got to be really good friends, and she was very helpful, and she convinced me that it was important to go to college and try to do that. And so she was very helpful, and I decided then that, well, what I would do is at least try to go to Rutgers at night. And one of the great advantages of going to Rutgers at night is you didn't have to take the SATs, and also your high school grades didn't matter. And since I had been in the lower quarter of my class in high school, I probably would never have gotten into Rutgers during the day. And so going to University College, which basically had open admissions at that time, was an extraordinarily good opportunity. It was also good for another reason for me. I had never really been away from home and rarely ate out and all that. And I met a lot of people at University College at that point who were veterans. It was post-Second World War, and it was just around the Korean War. And a lot of the students were men and women who had served in the armed services and were working and had families and so forth. And so they were going to school at night. And so that was a completely different environment for me. And I think, in many ways, I think it was that exposure to this group of people that led me to all of a sudden take studying somewhat seriously. And in University College, and I would meet these people. We'd have dinner together before I went to school, and it was a really not only a learning experience, but an opportunity to acclimate socially with a very different group of people, many of whom were obviously considerably older than me and had had much different experiences. And I think as a result of all that, and I don't know, probably some good teachers and the admonition from my friend, the social science teacher, to start being serious, I did very well at University College. And I got extraordinarily good grades. And so after 2 years, I decided that if I kept this up, I'd be here for 8 years, so forget that. And so what I did is I applied to Rutgers day school, and I got admitted and got a scholarship. And the insurance company that I worked for, the two gentlemen who really ran it, were very, very nice people, very helpful. And they said, look, work it out. You could come to work from 9 to 11, go to school from 11 to 1, come back here from 1 to 3, go back to school from 3 to 5. You keep your own schedule. And since the insurance company was on, I forget the name of the street, but off Broad Street, and I could walk to Rutgers in 10 minutes or so, I could do that. And so I stayed at Rutgers for 3 years and actually did get my degree in 5.
Any recollections of favorite courses or professors? Oh,
yeah. I think the most influential professor I had at Rutgers was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Henry Blumenthal. Was an unusual man. He taught courses in American diplomacy and generally courses in foreign affairs, and was taught pretty much along the Socratic method, which I had never really experienced. And Dr. Blumenthal had been had lived in Germany and had gotten his doctorate from the University of Berlin and taught in a German university. And then in 1938 or 39, left Germany. He was Jewish and realized that this was not a good place for him. And he left Germany, traveled to Brazil, and then I think from Brazil to the United States, joined the American Army, was an interpreter, in the Army for 4 years, and then came to Rutgers as a professor. And we got to know each other very well, and he was very influential in helping me in terms of thinking about what I might want to do and really helping me learn how to really focus more. He was an extraordinarily good analyst and teaching me the value of analytical thinking and looking at foreign policy issues and that. So I would say he was probably the most influential professor and very influential in what I subsequently went on to do. And then there was also a fellow by the name of Dr. Larson who taught political science. And he was somebody who I liked a lot and was also somebody whose courses in political science I found very, very interesting. And I guess the third person who I remember well is Dr. De Podwin, who was an economist and then subsequently became, I guess, dean of the business school, I think, at Rutgers. And while I was not a great student in economics, nor had a great interest in it, I had enough of an interest in it that to like his class and do that. I think if I can think back, I think those were probably the three people who I remember the most and probably had the most influence on me. But again, I think it was primarily Dr. Blumenthal. And in many ways, I considered myself extraordinarily lucky. In high school, I met, her name was Dr. LaPena, I think, and she was very helpful. And then in college, I had the opportunity with Dr. Blumenthal. So, great believer in the role that extraordinarily good faculty can play in helping and thinking about lots of things.
Now, you're back at Rutgers in your current role.
I might just tell you one other quick thing since about Blumenthal. The big issue I did face when I left, when I was at Rutgers, I had decided that I think I would go to law school. Why I decided this, I have no idea. But I thought that I had no head for figures, so I didn't want to be an accountant. And I realized that I would not be very proficient as an engineer. And while I had some real interest in some of the sciences, the fact that I had gone to night school for 2 years meant I couldn't take any lab courses. And so by the time I switched down to, to school during the day, it was really too late to pursue any kind of a career in any of the sciences because I wouldn't have had the necessary background, and I would have had to extend my college career. So I think law school sort of came by default. What else, to do? And the real issue for me was, do I go to Rutgers, where I had gotten the opportunity, I had gotten a full scholarship to go to Rutgers Law School, and should I try to apply to another law school? And Dr. Blumenthal said, look, why don't you try Harvard? And I said, well, I'll never get into Harvard Law School. He said, no, I think you might. They don't have too many students who've gone to night school. It's like diversity was going to work in my favor. So he said, look, I'll help you with the application. Why don't you do that? And I really thought about that. And I had one other thought, which everybody really laughed at me. I was going to apply to naval ROTC training and become a naval pilot. I don't know why I got that idea, but luckily my eyes were such that I couldn't pass the physical, so that ended that career. Anyway, he convinced me to at least apply to Harvard, and I applied to Harvard, and I think much to my surprise, I actually got admitted, and then had a real issue about where to go because of financial considerations. And while Harvard had a very generous program, they would provide half scholarship and half loan. It still required you to have some expenses on your own, and they also offered me a job when I was up there. Not a difficult one, was watching the library, something like that. So, and my parents had difficulty, I think, with the concept of me leaving and concerned about the economics of it and going. And I'll just tell you this one very quick story, which might be fun to anyway, so I'm trying to decide between Harvard and Rutgers, and my father are kind of trying to talk me into going to Rutgers, and everybody in my family is that I should stay here and all that. Well, I had a friend of mine who was going to Harvard, and in fact, a year ahead of me went to Harvard, and it was the only person who I knew who had gone there, and my mother met his mother in a supermarket, and his mother asked my mom, where's your son going to school? And she said, well, he's going to Rutgers or Harvard. She said, well, your son should clearly go to Rutgers because somebody from your background should not send somebody to Harvard. My mom came home and said, you're going to Harvard. So anyway, on those slender reeds, our major decisions in your life made.
Before we move on to your years at Harvard, I wanted you to sort of contrast Rutgers today versus Rutgers when you were a student. How has it changed?
Well, I think Rutgers today is a much more superior place than it was in those days. I think, you know, a tremendous amount of money and resources have gone into building the university and expanding its faculty. I think the number of courses that you could take are so diverse. When I went to Rutgers at Newark, the whole school was in a small building that used to be an insurance company, and an other building that used to be a brewery back in the early 30s. So if you had 30 classrooms, 40 classrooms, you probably had a lot. And you had a faculty that was very small, and diversity. I mean, you had some extraordinarily good faculty. I think Rutgers has always been very, very lucky and blessed in that sense that it has good faculty. And the students I still thought were of high quality. And the students today are of high quality. But I think overall, I mean, the university has grown. It's grown in reputation, grown in resources, and grown in faculty. So it's a place where you can get a really good, fine education. But I think you could have gotten it there at that point too.
Let's move on to that inferior school in Cambridge
right.
and talk about the
right.
years there.
Well, you know, I'm not sure. What would you like me to?
Well, again, any favorite courses or professors that you remember?
Well, what I remember. Well, I remember some positives and some negatives. I found it very difficult to acclimate myself to Harvard for the first couple of weeks. I mean, it was a world that was completely alien to my world I came from. And I always tell the story that I came up to Harvard. I didn't know. Figured, well, you ought to get really dressed up, and so I went to S. Klein on the square in Newark, if those of whom remembered S. Klein, and bought in the bargain basement a one-button roll, which was sort of like a two-button roll, double-breasted suit, but it had this one button, so it had bigger shoulders at that point, and it was like a purple suit. And I bought with that
what they used to call a zoot suit? Or?
Right, that's exactly right. And I bought with that a marvelous purple tie and tie that I'm somewhat embarrassed. It sort of one of these painted naked, somewhat naked ladies on it at that point. I thought that was really cool. Anyway, I remember going to class my first day up there, and a really very, very nice guy who was a third-year student from New Jersey, a fellow by the name of Marv Sachs, who became a very successful lawyer here, pulling me aside. I lived on the same floor with him, and he said, you know, Sandy, we don't dress like that here. And I said, Marvin, what's happening? He said, let me take you down to, it was a place in Harvard Square called J. August, and and bought me a tweed sport jacket and a couple pairs of khaki pants, which I wear till this day, and threw out the purple suit. So that's sort of an example of, in fact, for the first couple of weeks, I remember not even unpacking, because I figured, oh, I'm not going to stay in this place. It was really quite a different, it's one of the points that I try to make when I think how important it is today to make sure that we have access to kids who come from minority communities who haven't had the opportunity, you know, have the ability, but don't have the opportunity to go to some of the best universities in the country. And I think it's not only providing them with access intellectually and academically, but I think you really have to work with them on social issues and acclimating people to think that this is a place that they'll be comfortable with, and so forth, at least based on my experience. So I remember that as my initial recollections up there. And then I guess, you know, little by little, you know, those survival techniques I learned in Newark were helpful, and I you know, got acclimated and began to begin to not enjoy, I don't think anybody enjoys that place, but began to adjust to Harvard. I mean, I liked the idea of going away to school. I thought that was a great experience. And Cambridge and Boston were marvelous places to be, and the opportunity to be exposed to so many lectures and films and all kinds of things that the university provided. Although I was very limited in the amount of money I had, so that limited me very much in what I could do other than eat on the university's meal plan. But you know, I did manage to do it. I think if we talk a little bit about professors, the one who I remember the best and really impressed me the most was a fellow by the name of Mark D. Wolf Howe, who taught constitutional law and was an extraordinary scholar, but he was an extraordinary, in my view, humanist. And he brought to the study of constitutional law a very broad humanistic approach. So it was not like any of the other law courses I was in which, as you know, tend to narrow you and tend to constantly try to focus you and try to be very analytical. His approach to constitutional law was a much more humanistic and broader view of it. And that has always influenced me in terms of how I look at legal issues. I would say he was probably the fellow with the most experience, that I experienced the most. I think the course I disliked the most while I'm doing that was, believe it or not, a legal accounting course, which I had to take, which I think I sat through 3 sessions each day because I had no idea what the difference was between LIFO and FIFO and why I had to know any of this stuff. I figured I'd always hire an accountant if I had an accounting problem. But it was required. It was required. And so I would say, my days at Harvard were mixed. I mean, I did not enjoy the first year at all, and found that somewhat difficult acclimating. But I think I managed to get through pretty well in the second and third year and get some benefit out of it.
Now, you said you went to law school without any great desire to be a lawyer.
No.
Did you develop that desire while you were at Harvard?
Not really. I don't think so. I don't think that outside of constitutional law, and there was one other professor I should mention. There was a fellow by the name of Al Sachs, who subsequently became the dean at Harvard, and he taught courses in both contracts and legislation. But he was somewhat also like Mark de Wolf Howe. His view, contracts and legislation can be both philosophical and can be extraordinarily narrow. Contracts is a course that one can take a very broad and philosophical view of, and his view of legislation was the same. And I really got to like him a lot, and I learned a lot in those classes. And I think what I got from both of them was a sense that I liked law, but I didn't particularly like the intricacies of the law. I mean, I didn't find, for example, I took a tax course. I didn't find that interesting at all. I didn't want to spend my life trying to read the tax code and interpreting that. And I felt the same way about commercial law and all the issues that kind. And I thought civil procedure was more game playing than really serious, at least in the way it was taught. So I think I took a different view of the law. I came out of law school interested in the law as a means of social reform, law as a way of organizing and looking at social issues. But I was not particularly interested in saying, well, I'm going to become a bankruptcy lawyer. Not that I think these are, they're fine professions, fine aspects of it, but I wasn't interested in becoming extraordinarily knowledgeable about commercial law and bills of ladings and what that meant and who was sending what to whom. That didn't interest me. I wasn't particularly interested in the intricacies of property law. Go to a title insurance company. You know? So I think I had that different perception of it. What I thought I could do with it, I didn't know.
Well, your subsequent career has been marked by a series of public sector and positions that dealt with social policy. Was there, either at Harvard or outside, some mentor that pushed you that way?
I think some of it came from my exposure to the Mark DeWolf Howe and Al Sachs. I think some of it did come from there. But you remember, I went to law school at a period that if you talked about public interest law, nobody would know what you're talking about. And I went to law school at a period that there was almost no social reform, that the law had not really played. It was around Brown versus the Board of Education. I mean, that was, you know, heresy at that point. Also, Harvard Law School was a place that really, the values there were becoming a senior partner or a partner in a Wall Street law firm or a Boston law firm or an LA law firm. Everybody, your focus was towards interviews the last semester and summer jobs that would prepare you for that. And that was really the complete focus of the school. I don't even think there were any clinical programs at that point. If there was a clinic, I don't remember it, and I know I was not part of any clinical program because I don't think any existed at Harvard. And there was no attempt to really infuse in a student body any sense that law did have a role in social reform, or no attempt to really train lawyers to be a part of that. So when you came out of law school, you either went to a law firm or you went to government, or you did neither. And even there was not particularly much of an insight, much of a sense that you should go to government. The only other place that was really valued was clerkships, and only certain clerkships. You either had a clerk for somebody on the Supreme Court or on the Circuit Court of Appeals or a state Supreme Court. And if you were clerking for a district court, well, you know, why even talk about that? You know, I mean, it was such a narrow view, I think, of what law should be about and what law schools were about. And you know, classes were your basic classes were 120 students. Once in a while, you took a seminar where they would be smaller. And I quickly learned to sit in the back, so I didn't get called on. What? Right, you know. And I always tell the story. The first time I got called on, and that was the last teacher asked me whether I thought so and so was a strong judge. And I'd been to law school 3 weeks. And I turned and said, I didn't know the gentleman. How would I know whether he's strong or not? I accused of being a wise guy. Everybody else laughed. I said, what do I need this for? I'll move to the back. Anyway, so I don't think that my subsequent career really, except for those vague notions that I had from these two professors, really influenced it. I think that probably one of the great influences was my clerkship with the Chief Justice, Joe Weintraub, which was also really just by serendipity, because when I got out of law school, I got a job as a law clerk for a law firm, Riker, Emery, and Danzig, and in those days you had to still do a clerkship, so there were 2 or 3 clerks. We sat in a library, used to throw paper airplanes around. It was not a very serious profession because you had to keep, you know, a diary, and then before Weintraub became Chief Justice, they had this ridiculous rule that you had to do that for 8 or 9 months. And I then decided that, well, I guess what I should do is maybe I ought to go in the Army. I don't know why I decided that. And so I joined a National Guard unit, and I was 25 at that point. And I think if I had waited another 2 months, I would have been ineligible for the draft. But then I figured, well, you know, I've hung around, sat around for a long time. Well, you know, why don't I do this for a while? If I go through the National Guard and go in the Army that way, it may not be too bad. So I joined the National Guard, and under that program that they had, 6 months of active duty and then 6 months, 6 years. And then I got asked, you know, did I want to go to JAG and become an officer, but that was a 3-year enlistment. I didn't want to go do that. So I went into the Army for 6 months and got sent down to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, which was my first experience with segregation, because at that point South Carolina was still segregated, and I had a number of black friends who were with me in the Army, and then when we went to Columbus, to town, we couldn't go to the same restaurants. If we went to the movies, the black soldiers had to sit up in the balconies upstairs. I sat downstairs. I couldn't sit upstairs. Couldn't go to the same hotels. It was really upsetting and quite an experience to actually see what segregation was like in the state at that point, because this is before any of the Supreme Court cases.
About what year was that?
I think this was about 1960. 1959, 1960. So the big cases on interstate commerce and all that, and desegregations of the bus stations and all that didn't come yet. And Brown, which was 54 or 57, I can't remember, that just desegregated the school systems, but that said nothing about interstate facilities and that kind of thing. So that was my experience, you know, and I was basically in an infantry unit in Columbus at that point, and achieved the exalted rank of a PFC, private first class, which was major promotion on my part. And so I was there, as I said, for 6 months, and before I left, I had taken the bar exam, and I don't know if you want to hear a little story about that. It's just kind of a nice story. Anyway, I took the bar exam right before I left. I had clerked for Riker for 2 months, and then I went into the Army, and I took the bar exam. And I was in Fort Jackson, and we were out, I was out on, part of your basic training is you spend a week out on the rifle range, in which you're supposed to qualify with the M1 rifle and a couple of other weapons. And we were out there and doing that. It's way out, farther away from the base, but at the other end of the base. And so one night at roll call, at Reveille, at the end of taps, I'm sorry, early was in the morning, forget this. At the end of the day, we're all everybody's in formation, and I hear the captain call my name out and said, "Is there a fellow here by the name of Jaffe?" And I raised my hand. Very well. They call your name, that means you got some detail. So I hesitate to do anything, but I figure, what am I going to do? And he said, "I want to read a telegram out loud. It says, Dear Sandy, congratulations, you passed the bar. Sam, a friend of mine." So the captain said, "You know, I pass a lot of bars. I never get telegrams." And so he asked me, what did this mean? And so I am standing there in front of about 200 men, explaining that, that means I passed the bar. That's how I found out about passing the bar. Well, he said, "Isn't there a swearing-in ceremony?" And I said, "Yeah, there's usually one." The telegram had said there was one on a Friday morning. So he's a really nice guy. And he said, "I'll tell you what, I'll put you in a truck. And there's a train leaving at somewhere in the middle of the night, I think about 3 or 4 o'clock in the middle of the night, from Columbus, South Carolina, getting into Newark in the morning." And he said, "I'll put you in a truck. We'll drive you down there, and you can get that train, and you can, hopefully make your swearing-in ceremony. So I said, that would be great. And so with my fatigues and all, I jump into the truck and get driven down to the train station, get the 3 o'clock train. And unfortunately, the train was stopping in Trenton, but unfortunately, Amtrak in those days was not Amtrak, was no better on time than today. And we got stopped somewhere in the south, and we got into Trenton about an hour and a half after the ceremony was over. So I got off the train anyway because I didn't realize that. Then I looked and realized I think it was 11 o'clock or 11:30, and the ceremony had been at 9:30. So here I am at the Trenton station and trying to say to myself, what do I really want to do? Well, I figured, I'll call up the clerk of the court. And I called up the clerk of the Supreme Court, who was a fellow by the name of John Gilday, been there for many years. And by this time, Vanderbilt had died, and Minor had appointed Joe Weintraub as a Chief Justice. So I called Gilday up and said, explained who I was, and that I had just gotten in off the train, and I was in the Army and all that, and missed it. So he said, hold on for a minute. Let me see what I can do. So he comes back and he said, I've talked to the chief, and he said, come down and we'll take care of you. So I took a cab, went over to the courthouse, which was then right next to the state governor's office, and walk in and went to the clerk's office, and Gilday walks me into the Supreme Court, and there was Weintraub, who had convened the whole court. And then I'm standing there in the well of the court, and Weintraub swears me in front of the whole court. And each one of the justices shook my hand. I never forget that. And that's how I got sworn into the New Jersey bar. And it was, to me, an extraordinary experience.
Did he subsequently give you more background as to why he did that with the full court?
I think he just thought that, here was some guy, in soldier's uniform, and I had missed it. And that I think he just had probably turned to the court. They had probably were having lunch together, and he said, look, I'm going to do this. And they probably all just said that they would like to do it and just do it as a really nice thing. They all came out in robes. It was really quite an experience.
Why don't we take a short break?
Sure. Okay. We haven't even gotten to Brendan.
No, that's A.M. Stern.
Yeah, no, this fellow was Commissioner of Parks. Yeah. He was my roommate for a while.
Oh, I got that mixed up.
Okay, I'm going.
Okay.
Before we broke, Sandy, you said that you wanted to go back and revisit a couple stories that you'd forgotten.
Okay, these are just 2 quick stories that may have some relevance. After the first day in the Army, at night, in the barracks, was my sergeant called my name out. And again, I was kind of hesitant to say something because I had learned that if you stand in the middle with your eyes down, you're better off. You avoid any details. Anyway, so he said, I want to introduce you to this here man, Jaffe. And I kind of stand up, and he said, look at this guy. I should also preface this by I was one of the only people I knew from up my area who, instead of going to basic training in Fort Dix, I got lucky and went to Fort Jackson in South Carolina, and primarily with a group of fellows from Tennessee, primarily up in the hills of Tennessee. Had been a big company. Anyway, so I stand up, and he said, I want you to look at this fella. He said, this fella has had 19 and a half years worth of education, because you had to fill all that out when you went in. And he said, now you might think he's smart, but he really ain't smart. He'd spent 6 more months and put that time in the Army, he'd be ready to retire on a pension. I always liked that story. So anyway, not getting my, having spent it in school rather than in the Army, I didn't have my pension. Anyway, the other story, which really begins my legal career, is that I was in maybe at the 2nd or 3rd month. one of the sergeants came up to me and said, you know, I understand you're a lawyer. And I said, yeah. And he said, I also hear you went to Harvard, so you must be a good lawyer. I said, the first part of that is accurate, but the second part, not necessarily accurate, since I never practiced. He said, well, anyway, I got picked up for drunk driving. And he said, I can't afford a lawyer. Would you come and represent me? So I figured, why not? You know, my dad had once told me that in America, he said, you never turn a job down unless you can hurt people by doing it, like building a bridge. So I figured, why not? I'll do that. Because in one summer, I had 6 different jobs, including a bartender, which I knew nothing about. Anyway, so I go with him. Also, it gets me out of training that day, so I get all dressed up in my best Army uniform, and I go into town, and we go to the, I think it was the Recorder's Court, whatever they had in South Carolina, which was really kind of basically an extension of the judge's house. The judge has kind of been formal, sitting around in a sport jacket. So I sit down, and the judge says, who are you? And I say, well, that I'm here, and I'm going to represent the fellow. And the kind of judge looks at me, you know, I'm sitting there in my private's uniform, and he said, what's your name? I told him my name, and he said, why don't you come into my chambers, we'll talk for a minute or two. So I walk in his chambers, we sit down, he said, where did you go to law school? So I said, I went to Harvard Law School. When did you graduate? I tell him that, and he said, you know, I went there too. And we started talking a little bit about that. He said, you don't know anything about how to handle a case, do you? I said, no, I don't know anything about that. He said, it's obvious. He said, you don't know anything about it. I tell you what, we'll go out there, I'll find your man not guilty. It'll work out for you better that way. I go out, the guy's found not guilty. Well, the sergeant can't be more impressed with my legal skills. I got out of KP, and the word got around the whole Army base that I was this great lawyer who was able to get people off. That was the start of my legal career. And my great learning really came in handy. Anyway, Don, I didn't want to be too frivolous onto this.
Well, let's move your legal career a little bit further on. You get sworn in by the Chief Justice and the full court en banc.
Right.
Now, what's your next step? And also, what about the decision to come back to New Jersey rather than go to the big city or stay in Cambridge or Boston?
Wow. Well, I had no job. I never went on any of those interviews because I think instinctively I didn't want to work for any of those big law firms. So I really, when I got out of law school, I didn't really have a job, except, so when I came back, so the only place I could really come back to was New Jersey. Plus, I really did not financially have any money so that I could start live in an apartment any other place. The only place I could really live would be at home with my parents. So that kind of motivated me. That was the main reason to come back to New Jersey. And plus, I knew people in New Jersey, and I felt really comfortable with a lot of the friends I had here. So when I came out of the Army, I got a job as a law clerk again for the old Vanderbilt law firm. I think I just walked in one day and they said, fine. You know, it was very easy to get a job as a law clerk because I think they paid you $10 a week or something. And you didn't do very much except carry papers. And I was sitting there one day and I got a phone call from a friend of mine, Joel Handler. It was Justice Alan Handler's brother. And Joel and I became friends in law school. And Joel was clerking then for Justice Jacobs. And the Chief Justice had gone through the usual process and had hired a law clerk who was Bob Del Tufo. Evidently, the legislature at that point passed some judicial pay raise bill, and in it, they gave the chief a second law clerk. So Joel was talking with Justice Jacobs, and the chief mentioned, "Now I have another law clerk." And since it was now out of the hiring time, because I think this was really at the end of the summer or something like that, Jacobs turned to Joel and said, Justice Jacobs said to Joel, did he know somebody who Chief might want to interview? So Joel called me up and said, would I like to be interviewed by the chief? And I said, sure. So not having a suit at that point, I borrowed a suit from a friend of mine, Sam Kriegman, and got all dressed up. But the only trouble is Sam was 6'2", so it was a little bit big. And I walked in and I started to introduce myself and chatted with the chief. And we talked for a little while, and then he offered me the job. And I was convinced that he offered me the job because there was something about me he liked. And I think whether it was the suit that was too big or I came from Newark, because we really didn't talk much about my grades, and we really didn't talk very much about what I had done in law school. It was mostly a conversation about me and a little bit about him, about how he was brought up in Newark. And then he offered me the job. So I always felt that it was his sense that he wanted to take a chance on me rather than, was I on law review, which I was not, that kind of thing. So that was then I got to work for the Chief Justice. And
we'll talk about that relationship. Chief Justice Weintraub is a preeminent figure in New Jersey sort of history, and many people have suggested that he was somewhat an intimidating figure, both intellectually and on a personal level. How did you find him as a person?
Well, I can tell you a couple of stories that I think illustrate it. Also, by the way, he was extraordinarily close to Brendan, because Brendan had worked in his law firm, and there was a great deal of camaraderie between. I found Weintraub, he was somewhat off-putting, but I found him to be an extraordinarily decent person, and a person with a great sense of humanity, and a person who was also willing to teach. Two of those, I'll give you a couple of illustrations. There was one case before the New Jersey Supreme Court involving the construction of a lease. I won't go into all the details, but the clerks would write a 2 or 3 page memorandum for the chief, which would go to the other justices, in which you would kind of outline the facts, and you'd sort of come to a conclusion how you would decide the case. And the case was I just remember deciding the case, or at least giving my recommendation, on a very narrow interpretation of a lease, okay? And I brought that into the chief, and he sits and reads it, and turns to me and he said, you did exactly the thing that you would have been taught, that you taught in law school. You construed this lease, you construed it right. But he said, is that really a just result? Do you think that's a really good, fair, just result? And I said, no. And he said, no, it really isn't. And it wasn't because the lease had been entered into in the Depression, and the terms of it had not changed, and this fellow, the leasee had to pay the taxes, et cetera, and et cetera. Anyway, he said, if it's really an unjust result, we ought to really think about whether on the court we really want that kind of result. And he said, let's go back to the old English law. And he goes and he climbs up a ladder, and he brings down one of the old English books on equity. And he opens the book and he starts thumbing through the book, and he said, there was a doctrine in the old English common law, which we follow, which was that you don't have the right to waste another man's property. And he said, it seems to me that the court can apply that equitable principle in this case, and that equitable principle ought to override the construction of the lease, because it really is a much more powerful point. And so the court went along with that. And to me, I never wrote another memorandum that I didn't think about whether or not I thought this was the just result, and whether this was a result that really fit within the law but still would be just. And so he constantly, I think it was a tremendous educational experience for me. And one other story which that's okay.
You okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. One other story which I like to tell, because it shows my obstinacy and his perseverance, was another case that the court had. That was a very, very important case. Senator Joe McCarthy had come to Monmouth, Fort Monmouth, and in the course of a press conference he had at Fort Monmouth, he allegedly libeled a person, calling him a communist or something like that. The person sued for libel. And the issue before the court was whether or not the Privileges and Immunities Clause that applies to Congress members applied to a senator when he was not in the well of the Senate, and was at a different place. And the court subsequently held that it did apply. I kind of disagree. I disagree with that opinion. I thought that it was a press conference, whatever, and that he should be able to be sued. That was the issue. So I'm arguing with Weintraub about this, and we're having a real back and forth about it. And I think he's getting really exasperated with me, but I'm too stubborn and to realize my own fault. And finally, Weintraub turns to me, and he was sitting across from the table, and he said, "I'll tell you what. Would it make you happier if I wrote a footnote in this opinion that said the law clerk disagrees with me?" And me, like a dummy, said, "Yes, Chief, I really would have liked that." He said, "Don't come in here until tomorrow." And I go walking out. I said, "Oh, what a jerk I am." And but you know, he laughed the next day. I mean, it was not. Then Justice Jacobs came out to me afterwards next day, and he said, "I hear you're having some problems with the chief on this opinion. You don't like it." So it became kind of and Justice Francis was there in the same kind of a grouping, and they all made a big joke out of my obstinacy. Anyway, I found Weintraub to be an extraordinary just jurist. He had an extraordinary capacity to write short, declaratory sentences that were very, very clear. I mean, that was, I think, one of his great capacity. And he had an ability, I used to watch him in oral argument, he had an ability to cut through what he thought was the most important issue very quickly. And then generally, he could be intimidating, but if you knew what you were talking about, and you were forthright about it and sincere about it, that would be fine with him. It's where one story, I'll tell that one other story. It was a criminal case, and the defendant wrote a brief in which he had written 25 points, 25 reasons it should be reversed. And the 25th was that if none of the above reasons, all those 24 are sufficient to overturn this conviction, the combination of all these should be sufficient to overturn it. That was point number 25. So I walked into the chief and I said, writing the memo, "What do you do with this kind of argument? How do you handle that?" He said, "The easy way to handle that," he said, "you throw the brief in the wastepaper basket if that's the only argument he can make."
Why don't we take a quick break, get you a dry chair.
It's fine.
That's okay, but we could just...
Rob was also, I don't know.
Are you rolling?
No.
Oh.
No.
I'm rolling out.
Okay.
Yeah, and he was also very influential in obviously helping me get my next job. Should we go into that?
Sure.
Yeah,
Well, before you do, let me interrupt.
Sure.
You've mentioned a little bit about his interaction with the other justices, but discuss that a little bit more. Again, he had the reputation of being such a leader on the court and somewhat intimidating even to the associate justices. Yeah. Did you get a feel for that, or was that a little outside the scope of the court?
I didn't get that sense. It was Justice Weintraub, Jacobs, Francis, and Scatino in that little suite, which was down, I think, 580 Broad Street. And Justice Jacobs, as you remember, was really a brilliant person. It would be very hard to intimidate Justice Jacobs on an intellectual basis. And I think Justice Francis and Justice Scatino were really well thought of as jurists. May not have been as extraordinarily academically the same league with Justice Jacobs, or maybe, I'm not sure, but they were really well thought of and very, very competent justices. And Justice Francis, I remember, was a very, very decent guy and a person who would spend a lot of time with all the clerks. The clerks had a little library, and all of us sat out there in one big room. And Justice Francis would come out and spend a lot of time. He'd talk to the clerks, and this is one of the things the court was facing. What did we think, and so forth. And so would Justice Jacobs. Scatino, not too often. And then they usually, the four of them went to lunch together. There was a cafeteria in there, and they'd usually go to lunch together. And I never got the sense that there was anything but the greatest mutual respect and admiration between those four. You know, I mean, I don't know very, you know, obviously there are three other justices, and I wasn't really very much privy to their doings. But I never got the sense that it was anything but that.
Okay, well, now let's move on to the next career step.
Okay. Well, now we're clerking for the chief, and about 7 or 8 months into that, and chief calls me in one day and said, you know, what are you going to do after this? And I hadn't really thought much about that either. And so I figured, well, what happened? So he said, look, if you want to clerk another year, you can do that. He said Del Tufo was going to. And, you know, I thought about that, and I said, you know, I really enjoy this job, and I really like it a lot, but I don't think I really want to do this for another year. So he said, well, what do you want to do? I said, really don't know. I said, I think I'd really like to learn a little bit how to be a trial lawyer. And so he said, if you really want to do that, the best place to do that would be the prosecutor's office. He said, if you go to a law firm, you'll never get to try cases until you're old. And he said, they don't try many cases anyway. And you'll do depositions and that kind of thing. So he said, why don't you go to the prosecutor's office? And, you know, Brendan Burns just got appointed as prosecutor. Minor had appointed him. And I think he'll run a really good office. He's a bright guy. And I would suggest you try that. So I called up Brendan's office and got an interview, particularly when I told the secretary that I was clerking for the chief. And I got an interview with Brendan. And I went down, and he was in the county courthouse at that point. We chatted, and you know, I liked Brendan, and I think we got along fine. And Brendan said, well, you know, I'm looking to hire someone, but I can't. You don't have any trial experience. You know anything about a courtroom? I said, no. I never even took trial practice in law school. Not that that would have meant anything. So I think I took an evidence course, but I learned absolutely nothing in that either. So. Anyway, Brendan says, what I would like you to do is I'd like you to write briefs, be in the appellate section. And he said, I got a guy by the name of Billy Caruso, I don't know if you know him, who's the head of the appellate section. But he said, you know, the man's in his 70s. And frankly, Brendan said, you know, he drinks a little bit here and there, but, you know, I'm not going to get rid of him. But, you know, I need somebody else to write briefs. So I kind of groaned. And he said, why are you groaning? I said, well, you know, I want to learn how to try cases. I don't want to write briefs. I've been doing that, sort of. Well, he said, that's what I'll offer you. But he said, you can, if I'm not around, you can sneak a trial here and there. So I figured, okay, I'll do this. But he said, you need to do one thing. He said, you know, I just need to get, I don't need to, he said, but it would be really good if you got the approval of, just got the backing of the senator. And I think it was a fellow by the name of Fox then was a senator. So I said, okay, and I left, and I have no political connections at all at that point. So I called up Joel, and Joel said, I said to Joel, can I go see your father? His father, Charlie Handler, was well known politically in Newark and had been at one point corporation counsel for the city of Newark. And we ran a very successful practice, a very nice man. So I went over to see Charlie Handler. You know, Joel set the appointment up for me. So I go to see him, and I tell him what I want to do. And he said, fine. He said, let me call up your the guy who's in charge of your ward. I forget the name of the guy. So he dials the phone, and he calls the guy who's in charge of the ward. And he said, I've got this fellow, Sandy Jaffe, you know, he's a friend of my son's. Would you talk to the senator for him? So the guy comes back and says, no, I won't do it. And he said, why not? He said, well, I want a job there. I'm not going to support him. So that ended my political thing. So I went back, fairly dejected, and Chief called me and said, what happened? And I said, well, you know, I tried this, and I told him about the story, and I don't really know where to go next. So he gets his secretary on the phone. He said, get me the prosecutor on the phone. And Brendan answers the phone. He said, do I understand, Brendan, that you want my law clerk to get the approval of the senator? The chief turns to me and said, you got the job. But so that's how I got the job with Brendan. And I don't know whether in retaliation for that or else he just needed it. But when I remember I finished clerking for the chief, I think it was obviously the beginning of the summer, end of June, or when the term ended. And I told Brendan that I was going away and I was going to start work, I think August 1st or September 1st or something, but I was going to take a long vacation and going away with a whole group of friends. So he said, okay, but he said on one condition. I said, what that? He said, you've got to take the Sturtevant murder case with you, and so you could write the brief when you come back. I want you to read the whole trial transcript. So I go away on this vacation with this huge, and that was a very, very brutal murder case that was in the office for a long time. And so I take this with me and write the brief over my vacation. I kidded Brendan. I don't know whether that was retaliation or he really needed the brief done. I think it was more the latter. And so that's how I started working with Brendan.
Before you started working with Brendan Byrne in the prosecutor's office, had you ever heard of his name before?
Not really. I mean, I'd heard the name. Weintraub had mentioned the name a couple of times, and I'd seen on briefs that came from the Essex County Prosecutor's Office his name. And I don't remember whether Brendan had ever argued a case in a court while I was there as a clerk. I don't remember. But I had heard, you know, and I knew and I'd heard about his dad. His dad had been very active in West Orange, politics. And so I kind of knew that, but it was a very limited knowledge and understanding because, you know, I had been away, law school, then I'd been in the Army, and then, you know, I had not really had that much of an exposure to what was then happening in New Jersey.
Did you know any of the political background surrounding his appointment by Governor Minor as prosecutor?
No. Except that Minor appointed him, and that I think Brendan had been friends with Minor, or his dad had been. I assume his dad had been very influential in that, but I didn't know the political background. Weintraub never mentioned it, and I never did know it.
How did the job in the prosecutor's office work out?
Really well. I like working in a prosecutor's office. I was probably, it was at that time a part-time job. I think it paid $6,000 or $7,000, and you could work half-time and still keep a private practice. But since I had no private practice to keep, right, and since I was not going into any law firm, I want to do that, I worked full-time. And I was one of the only people there. Me and Billy Caruso, who was there too, sitting around, we worked full-time. And so I used to write briefs, which I didn't like doing very much, and I got so proficient at it that, you know, when you write a brief, you know, the weight of the evidence is this, you know, the jury verdict. I would have these, no computers in those days. I would have all this stuff all ready, and I'd just tell the secretary, type in these 10 pages right here, and then I'll make the argument afterwards, because I got really proficient at doing this. But I really wanted to learn how to try cases. So, and I kept bugging Brendan about it. And Brendan was happy, I think, to keep me doing briefs, because I had clerked for Weintraub. I knew how to write a brief. I think he was pleased with the quality of work that was coming. And, you know, anybody that tried the cases, they figured. So one day, Brendan was out, was going somewhere. And I turned to one of the guys in the office, I think it was a fellow by the name of McEwen, I can't remember, and said, you know, Brendan's gone. Can I try a case while Brendan's gone? And he said, yeah. He said, the only trouble is, he said, it's a manslaughter case, pretty serious case. I know, I don't care, I'll try anything. So he said, prepare yourself. I had about 20 minutes to prepare. And that's one of the funniest stories. So I go up, and it was before, I remember, Judge Masucci, and I put the witness on, and I had watched a couple of cases by then, so at least I knew what side to sit on. That was about it. And so I asked, I'll never forget this, I had to introduce the pictures of the decedent to establish the death and the identification, okay? And one of the ways I learned to do it, the detective said to me, I had one of the detectives helping me, he said, show the picture to the, I think it was either the wife or mother, it was a woman who was a relative. And he said, more likely than not, she'll break down and cry, and that'll be great for the jury. Oh, good, okay, I'll do that. So I stand up and I mark this picture for identification purposes and then go over and say, that as I'm doing that, opposing counsel gets up and they're willing to stipulate that this picture is of the decedent and that establishes it. And I say, oh no, because the guy's giving me the elbow, says don't agree to that. So I get up and I say no. The defendant's lawyer gets up again and says, Your Honor, I can't understand why the prosecutor won't agree to this. We're willing to agree to it. And I said, no, I need to try it this way. So the judge looks at me and he said, you really want to do it that way? I said, yeah. So the judge says, well, I'm not going to tell him how to try the case. Let him do it his way. So I go and I show the picture to the woman. She looks at the picture and she says, I never saw that picture. At that point, I fall backwards and I fall down. I am so taken aback. I quickly get up and I say, I'm willing to accept counsel's stipulation to move it into evidence. And the guy turns and says, what do you think, I'm a dummy? So I call a recess. I learned a lot about how to prepare a case after that. And so we took a recess and refreshed her recollection and then put her back on the stand, and she identified the person. But I figured that was a good lesson for me to learn. And the judge had fallen off his chair. He thought it was the funniest thing that had ever happened.
So what happened with the case?
And actually, there was a conviction.
Despite your best efforts.
Despite my best efforts. But you got more. Yeah, one of the other, I think, really interesting cases that really got me very, very much involved working with Brendan was there was, I'm still in the appellate section, and there was a shooting up at a place called the Fremont Club, which was a tavern up in the east end of Newark. And the person arrested was a fellow by the name of Tony Boy Biardo, who was one of the top fellows, at least alleged to be one of the top fellows in criminal enterprises in the state. And Biardo was arrested for that. And there was a grand jury hearing into that shooting. And Joe Lordi, who was then the first assistant prosecutor, an extraordinarily competent, very nice guy, Joe came up to me one day and said, look, you really want to learn a lot. Why don't you come and sit with me, and I'll show you how to run a grand jury, and this will be a really significant case. You'll learn a lot. So I went and was part with Joe in the grand jury. Well, as it happened, Biardo, before the grand jury, took the Fifth Amendment, his right to right not to incriminate himself. And so the grand jury held him in contempt, and there was then a proceeding before the judge as to whether or not he should be held in contempt, or whether or not it was appropriate for him to take the Fifth Amendment. And we proceeded on a contempt charge. Well, when we went down to Judge Conklin before, Joe turned to me and said, you argue the motion. It was a motion, okay? And so I argued the motion as to why the Fifth Amendment didn't apply. And I won on that account. And the judge sentenced him to, I think, 10 days in a county jail, which got me in trouble with the judge, because afterwards, being a wise guy, judge said, wow, boy, that was a tough sentence. I said, well, Your Honor, I'm sure they'll send you a bouquet of roses. He said, don't show up in my courtroom again. It was a silly thing for me, a dumb thing. Anyway, so Biardo is sentenced, but there's a stay of appeal, and it goes to the New Jersey Supreme Court. It was a landmark case on the interpretation of the Fifth Amendment in this context. And I write the brief with Brendan's help because it was such a significant. And Brendan went and argued the case before the New Jersey Supreme Court. And it was a packed courtroom because it was such a significant case. And the Attorney General, who was then David Furman, also argued as amicus because of the state's interest in this matter. And I don't recall who argued for the defense. Anyway, the case gets argued, and about a month or two later, the court comes down and does not issue a ruling. It says it wants the case re-argued. And it wants it re-argued, and it listed two questions that it wanted the re-argument to focus on. And I remember Brendan walking into my office and saying, this is what the court did. And he said, we're going to have to rewrite the brief. And I said, I understand that. And I think one of the most selfless acts I've ever seen a person do, really, very selfless on Brendan's part, he turned to me and he said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to do the re-argument. I said, me? Really? And he said, he said, obviously, he said, after this first argument, they had some questions and maybe they were not answered, or I don't know what the issue is, but I think it would be interesting for them and important for them to have someone else present this. And I said, are you really serious about that? And he said, yes, I'm really serious. I'd like you to do it. I said, well, I said, that's a tremendous opportunity. So I wrote the brief and then went down to the Supreme Court, invited my whole family to come. It was my first argument before the Supreme Court. And Brendan came, and Brendan sat with me at counsel table. And I argued the case, and the chief was sitting up there, obviously giving me some really interesting questions. And
Tough or easy?
very difficult, very difficult. One really funny side, when Dave Furman was arguing the case for the Attorney General after I had gone on, the court, John Gilday, the court clerk, comes out to each one of the justices and starts talking to them. Each one of them turns around with their back. And, I would have been appalled if that had happened. What I heard was one guy saying, I'll have a tuna fish sandwich, I'll have a ham and cheese. You're ordering their lunch? I thought to myself, well, thank goodness it didn't happen during my argument. I would have been really nonplussed. Anyway, it was a really extraordinary experience. I remember traveling down and then having lunch with Brendan afterwards and talking about it.